Fighting Through Podcast, Episode 73. Jack Stansfield, POW in World War II. More great unpublished history. One winter's evening, about 2 years before his death, my father Jack Stansfield was sitting at home in front of a coal fire, and without any apparent reason started to talk calmly about his life as a prisoner of war during World War II. I was shocked. A group of prisoners working on the farm were locked in a barn each night. The local Polish blacksmith, who'd been ordered to install iron bars on the windows, managed to do so in such a way that they could be easily removed. We marched into the town behind the Union flag and got a great reception from the senior Russian officer, who insisted that we be given the best billets for the night. An American soldier with a serious gunshot wound on the side of his head came into the camp hospital. He was from Texas. The doctor told me he didn't think the American sergeant would live the night out. Prisoners were ordered to set out on what became known as the Long March, or the Death March, west, as the German forces attempted to delay the liberation of the POWs by the advancing Soviet army. Hello again, and another warm World War II welcome to the Fighting Through Second World War podcast. I'm Paul Cheel, son of Bill Cheel, whose World War II memoirs have been published by Pen and Sword in Fighting Through, From Dunkirk to Hamburg. The aim of this podcast is to give you the stories behind the story. You'll hear memoirs and interviews with veterans in all the countries and all the forces. I dare you to listen. This episode, I've got a great story of Jack Stansfield as a POW prisoner of war in Poland. Jack was with the Green Howards, same battalion as Dad, and he was captured by the Germans during the Dunkirk campaign in 1940, a fate which Dad avoided by the skin of his teeth, as we'll find out later. Also, we've got a few family histories to share and one or two bits of war stuff this time. Firstly, I've got some very sad news to share with you. 6th of October 2021 marks the passing of Tank Captain Stanley Perry. Stan served with the Sherwood Rangers as a tank commander and fought his way across northwest Europe, being wounded twice. I was lucky enough to interview Stan a couple of years ago, and you can hear his memories in episodes 36 and 37, Captain Stan Perry. Stan regaled us with no end of jaw-dropping as well as funny tales of his time in Normandy in 1944 with the Sherwood Rangers. And I don't think I've ever heard quite so many scary stories in one go, and I know I've never met anyone carrying more injuries and shrapnel in his body. I'm now going to replay a few extracts from his interview with me.
We weren't. We were brash. We'd seen a lot of blood and guts.
Yes, yeah. What was the closest you got to killing an enemy, or closest distance-wise? Because obviously, from what you've been saying, you did have some fairly close quarters.
Well, there's the closest I did shoot a German at about 3 yards.
Pistol?
And that was while I was in the tanks, and I did a little recce into this house. I was worried about passing a house that they could chuck bombs down from the window.
Yes.
And if you hadn't got your lids closed, you might be the recipient of a grenade. So
right.
If we were going through a little narrow village, something with houses, I'd sometimes do a little foot recce.
Right.
And I went into this place, and there were 3 Germans sitting there. and I kicked the door open.
Yeah.
And I said, handy hock or something like that.
Yes.
And the first one with his hands up, I shot. Sorry, that was why I brought up.
Yeah.
The one with his hands up first is the big danger.
Oh, really?
Because he's the quick reactor.
Ah, okay.
And he's the one you shoot.
And then the other two come quietly.
And then the other two, and so we took the other two prisoners. I did go into one where my earlier training had been handy as well. Went into a house, and there was a bottle of wine stood on the table.
Right.
And a glass beside it. And I always took my gunner with me on these things. He was a good lad.
Yeah.
He took my gunner with me. And he said, oh look, he said, there's some wine there. Don't touch that. Looked underneath, and there was a nail. There'd been a hole drilled in there.
Gosh. And
a nail on a spring.
Yeah, yeah.
And when the nail popped up, it got a little anti-personnel mine.
Booby trap.
Sticked under the booby trap. So
gosh.
She lifted the bottle up came the nail.
Yes.
And
wow.
Sneaky.
Sneaky.
So, but to say with a bit of earlier training,
you were ready for it?
Well, I was able to disable it without setting it off. That was quite handy.
What was it like taking a prisoner? What was it, the feeling? Did you feel anything, or...?
I suppose, if anything, you felt there's another couple of buggers out the way.
Yeah, yeah.
When I rejoined the regiment, I had to go and get a new photograph taken for my identity card.
Right.
Because the other one was out of date or something, or I'd lost it or something.
Yeah.
And I was sent down to Maastricht. Would you believe? 4 places.
To where?
Maastricht.
Right. Is Maastricht in Belgium? Oh.
It's on the Belgian-Dutch border, isn't
yeah,
it?
okay, yes.
And it's a big bridge over the river, and it was manned up by American soldiers, and I'd been sent off in a jeep to go and get this damn photograph taken, and a couple of robed priests, long black robes and funny little hats,
right,
had thumbed a lift off me, and somehow I wasn't really quite happy. They were supposed to be Dutch Roman Catholic priests,
yeah,
and they were going down to Aachen, they said. Oh, I wasn't very happy. It's somewhat odd.
I was on my own.
So I drove into the middle of Maastricht Bridge, which was manned all the way up with American soldiers. I drove into the middle of the bridge and I said, get out. Why? Just get out for a minute. And they got out of my jeep, and I beckoned up a couple of the American soldiers and said, have a look at these, I'm not quite sure. Then we had a look, and one of them was wearing long boots.
Right.
And they were a couple of Germans who dressed up as priests.
Oh, gosh.
Escaped prisoners of war.
Yeah.
Had dressed up as priests.
Wow.
And so I handed them over to the Americans, and Stanley Christopherson got a little note from the American commander praising the astuteness of one of his members.
Yours truly.
For catching a couple of German prisoners.
Oh, well done.
But my gunner shot one. We'd got 3 in a row, and they were dressed up in priests' get-up.
As well.
And my gunner suddenly shot one. I said, Christ, what have you done? I said, Geneva Convention, they're prisoners of war.
Oh, gosh.
And he said, no, they're bloody not. I said, look at that. And again, he was wearing jackboots. And it was right, they were 3 Germans dressed up.
Yes.
But we always handed over, you couldn't bugger about too much. There were, I suppose there were acts of bravery by German soldiers. You could take a few prisoners.
Yes.
And hands up. And they put their hands up that way. And if they were like that.
Yes.
Or like that.
So if their palms were facing you, that was okay.
If their palms are facing you.
Yeah.
If their palms weren't facing you, they might have a grenade in this hand.
Yes.
And
it's not a natural way to hold your hands.
No, it's not.
With your palms behind.
So you became aware of those sorts of things and looked out for it. But otherwise, it was just a matter of get rid as quick as you could.
Yes, yeah.
Because they were in the way of the tank.
Wow.
Infantry, of course, had different roles to play.
Were you in the infantry at some point?
No.
No.
I'm never in infantry.
No. It's just the reason I'm asking you is that
This is my British Tommy helmet I've got out.
I brought this off eBay. It's 1938, so it is true.
Okay.
Oh, can I take a photograph?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Have you worn one like that?
I've worn one like that, yeah.
Oh, right.
We used to carry these slung on our gas mask containers.
Okay. So when would you have worn one of these?
Theoretically in the tank.
Right, okay, but you wouldn't...
And theoretically it saved you from getting shot in the head by a sniper.
Yeah.
But in practice, you got a lot of face showing. You know, all this is there for the sniper.
Exposed, yes, yeah.
And I was lucky. Lucky for me, my sniper wasn't quite good enough. He was about 3 or 4 inches out.
Yes, yeah, on your arm, yeah.
It was like that.
Yeah.
And I got hit here. They were damned uncomfortable, actually.
Were they?
Mostly. Against the rules, we wore berets.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I remember my squadron commander, Jackie Holland, on one occasion, the weather turned pretty foul about the middle of July, I think it was. It would be about the middle of July, I think. We got some pretty foul weather. Jackie Holman went into action.
This is your commander?
With an he was my squadron commander.
Yeah.
He went into action with an umbrella up. I wasn't getting rained on.
I can hardly hold the camera still.
That was Jackie Holman.
He didn't get shot then?
No, he got away. Well, as I say, a lot of the time we went into action, head and shoulders showing, and just wearing a beret.
Yeah, sorry, Wadi Akarit, Dad was crossing an anti-tank ditch, and in that vicinity there was a tank commander or somebody lying over the top of the turret, entrails everywhere, and it was a horrible sight.
Yeah.
But you were exposed at times, I guess.
Well, I'm talking about the Noiro. We actually got the sniper who shot me, incidentally.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. He was up a poplar tree.
Right.
There was a little row of poplar trees.
Wow.
And I said to my gunner, I reckon the bugger's up in one of them trees.
Yeah.
So we raked up and down all poplar trees.
Yeah.
With machine gun fire.
Yes.
And all of a sudden somebody popped out of one.
Wow.
And I'm sure he was the bloke who shot me, so he got his come up.
So yes, absolutely.
Yes. And
we were talking about the Spandau earlier.
Yes.
And I forgot, I didn't finish the story. In a nutshell, Dad spotted a German hiding in some bushes with a Spandau.
Yes.
And so they took a patrol out and crept behind him. And then when they found him, he was already dead. He had a knife in his back.
Good.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
good job, really, because if he'd been alive, he might have well shot them all.
Yeah, he might well have had a go, mightn't he?
What's the... can you think of any... Well, you've already told me no end of funny moments, actually. But are there any other particularly funny incidents you can remember from your war days?
Perhaps one of the funniest moments, when I joined the Sherwood Rangers, in my first troop, I had a couple of ex-Nottinghamshire miners. And the Nottinghamshire miners had a curious thing they called backslang.
Right. Backslang.
Backslang.
Yeah.
And it went something like this. Ude uye orte akbe angslay, which is, do you talk backslang? And you take the first letter of the word and put it at the back and add a to it. So do becomes ude.
Yeah.
And you becomes uye. And I had a couple of chaps in the tank who spoke backslang, and I thought they used to have a little chat, a little giggle, you know.
Yeah.
And I thought, you sods, you're talking about me, but I can't understand what you're saying. Yeah, I think you might be taking the mickey.
Yeah.
So very quietly, I found out what backslang was about.
Yeah.
And I learned how to translate it.
Yeah, yeah.
And they were chatting one day, and I said, "Morning, mayhaps, Shay. Are ye all tired Bangsley?" And the looks on their faces. Christ, what have we been saying? The old man talks backslang.
So what did you just say to them then?
Nothing. I just left it as a joke.
Oh, all right. Yeah. Okay. You were just yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't really mind. I took this view very much not regular army.
Yeah.
My tank crew all called me Stan.
Yeah.
When we were sleeping under a bloody canvas sheet together, I was Stan.
It would have made you quite close, wouldn't it, I guess?
If we were on parade, it was a salute.
Yeah.
Or if we were standing outside the tank and somebody was nearby,
yes, yeah.
It was a salute, and they called me Sir.
Yeah.
But when we were in the tank, and they called me by my Christian name, so...
I suspect from whatever orders you gave them, they would respect them and...
Well, that was it.
Jump to it.
I think leadership is not about that sort of discipline. Leadership is about self-discipline for a start, and about setting an example.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a matter of respect, but it's a two-way thing, respect.
Yes, yes.
Not just them respecting you, you've got to respect them.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that was the way I think that was why I was happy and comfortable in factory life.
There you go. If you want to catch up with all Stan's exploits, listen to episodes 36 and 37 of the podcast. That's Stan Perry, the last troop commander of the Sherwood Rangers. R.I.P. Stan, you will be missed by all. A few bits of feedback and family history now. Peter Douglas Cray from Australia wrote in, says, I discovered your podcasts earlier this year and I've been listening to the episodes on the bus to and from work. Occasionally I'll listen when I'm on the rack at the gym. Like many boomers, of which I just qualify, across the Commonwealth, I grew up in the shadow of the 2 World Wars legacies. I've got childhood memories of Airfix plastic models, Commando and battle comics, along with the annual attendance at the Anzac Day Parade. Do you know, I used to get the Hotspur and Victor comics at various times, and even today I've still got a good number of them in my loft, hand-bound into like an annual. I can't believe it, but we hang on to these mementos, don't we? Every now and again I get one of those Commando comics to read too. They always have a full colour picture on the front, and I've started to pick up ones which cover my favourite parts of the war, like Dunkirk and D-Day. Peter continues, 2 years ago I revisited the War Memorial in Blackall in central Queensland. The name A. Douglas was inscribed on the southern side of the plinth. I was a little perplexed, as I never noticed the name on previous sites to the town, nor had it been pointed out by my mother's family. As a boy, I had an insatiable interest in war-y stuff, especially the Japanese mountain gun in the Memorial Park. There's a family history of Gallipoli, the Light Horse, Spitfires and Beaufort bombers on my father's side. Very little from my mother's side, other than a little of my grandfather's World War II service that included 2 weeks' detention for going away without leave so he could attend my uncle's birth, to which the said uncle was late. Old Joffrey, nicknamed after the French general, had been a biscuit bomber crewman. I didn't appreciate that role until one day he mentioned seeing the men fighting on the ground. Literally, he summed up his wartime service with those scant words. I assume this sight would have been the muzzle flashes in the jungle, and if he could see them, the Japanese could see his plane. I'm not sure whom he hated more, the Japanese or the officers, as both were bastards in his eyes. The latter was still hard felt, as he didn't attend my brother's graduation from Royal Military College at Duntroon in 1984. Mind you, he was very proud to be photographed alongside of him as a young major when my brother gave the Anzac Day address in Blackall some years later. Back to A. Douglas on the War Memorial. I asked my mother about the name, and she told me Arthur was my great-grandfather's brother, and he'd run away from home as a teenager. He'd grown tired of his strict father and the floggings. Mum told me, according to Gran, that Arthur had been a Lewis machine gunner. Not much more to be said, a reflection of the family's stoicism. Ignore the pain, and it'll fade away. I've since learned Arthur was a member of the 52 Battalion, 1st Australian Imperial Force, and he was killed in action during the night of Villiers-Bretonneux. Maybe, had I known he was a gunner, I might have been more keen to carry one as a young digger, but the machine guns are heavy and a mongrel of a thing to haul around an obstacle course. During the short Brisbane COVID lockdown, and following the 10-kilometre local exercise directive, I took to walking the dogs in the Toowong Cemetery. There are many Commonwealth War Commission headstones in the cemetery. Most of these are broken and ruined blokes who died young. Profoundly sad reminders of those who grew older but not that old. I've gleaned some basic information from the records. You can tie some of the men to the actions of Arthur's battalion. One a gunshot wound to the lower jaw, and another a shrapnel wound to the face, resulting in an eye excision. Ernest Younger wrote about the terrible nature of a jaw wound in his book Storm of Steel. Dreadful stuff. No family member has ever visited Arthur's grave, and I intend to be the first when my wife and I travel to the UK in the future. I'll take some red earth from Kungari country, or is it Kungari country, and place it on his plot. I know you've received many comments about the strangeness of enjoying the podcasts. Well, I do enjoy and appreciate the stories of the men who could be those unnamed faces in wartime photography and film. Kudos to you for keeping your dad's and his generation's legacy alive. Kind regards, Peter Douglas Cray. P.S. mate, a bit of strong pronunciation. Brisbane, Melbourne, Canberra. Says me, so it's not Brisbane, Melbourne and Canberra then. And Peter says, ignore my sledge about pronunciation. I do not recall which British actor made the claim, but he said that one can only master the Australian accent by speaking as if your mouth is full of barbed wire. It works then. Thanks, Peter. Good on you, mate. I think I sounded more like Brit Janet Street Porter than Aussie folk hero Barry Mackenzie, but there we go. Oh, God. 2 or 3 different accents in there. Spot the difference for a competition. Buy me a coffee. Kindly provided Greg Guffrey, or Guifrey. Thank you very much, Greg. And also Jamie Beale from Glastonbury in the UK. And Jamie says, hi Paul, just finished episode 72 and just wanted to say the show is aging like a fine wine. Just excellent. The Christmas episode last year, 2020, was very moving, especially the German choir, as mentioned in your dad's book. So the bar is now set very high, Mr. Cheel. Well, thank you, Jamie, and you've prompted me to remind everyone about sending in any Christmas at War stories. I'm curating a nice number already, but none as yet from a listener, apart from a lovely story and much more sent in by American Rainey Horvath about her pilot father who flew military transport over the Himalayan mountains on the so-called China-Burma-India route, the CBI. And that'll be coming soon to a podcast near you. Which podcast is that then, Paul? The Fighting Through podcast, of course. And, I've also got a bonus reading from Heidi Langbein-Allen's memoir about her German father Willy as a boy soldier. So you'll hear how he spent one Christmas. Greg Parfit sent in a survey response recently and basically saying keep up the good work and it ain't broke, so don't fix it. So thanks, Greg. I think evolution rather than revolution is the watchword based on that comment. And I've had some feedback on the CBs from George Guiver. Wonderful episode. Sometimes these CBs are forgotten for how much they contributed to the Allied victory. I was anxious to see his paintings and drawings, and did not get disappointed. So that's George Guiver, or Guiver, on Facebook. Family story now from Todd Kehoe in the USA. Todd says he's totally enjoying the American Ranger series at the moment. That's Private First Class Morris Prince, episode 56, Omaha. He said, my grandfather was Private First Class Franklin McCaffrey. He was certified as a sharpshooter with an M1 in the infantry, and he fought on Omaha and Normandy for 9 days before he got wounded via an MG-42, and he had a leg wound the rest of his life. And Todd sent me a photograph of his overloaded bookshelf, which displayed a copy of Dad's book. And Todd added, you know you're afflicted, as Al Murray would say, when your Second World War bookshelf is in chronological order, covering firstly memoirs and then strategic or tactical books. No doubt in alphabetical order as well, Todd. And I would highly recommend the Ian W. Toll trilogy on the Pacific campaign. Well, Todd, I would recommend therapy, but thank you for getting in touch. Bit of war stuff now. The King's Choice. I've just been watching a very suspenseful and educational drama based on Norway's involvement in the Second World War, and it's all about the choices faced by the King and the democratic government of Norway following the invasion of the country by Germany under the pretense of protecting them against British invasion. It's a new production and it's available through BBC 4, hopefully on a TV channel near you. And at the end of it, I noticed in the credits what I thought was quite an evocative dedication and message for today's generation. And it said, for our children and for you, the generation about to take over. Understand. Remember and pass it all on. So that's the King's Choice about Norway in the war on BBC 4. Michael Stapleton has written in about the Pointe du Hoc in France. Hi Paul, doing a bit of research on Normandy for my trip next year, and I've come across a German position I've never even heard of. It's just off Pointe du Hoc. It's called Maisie, and it seems the Germans let the Allies know all about the point, but this position you can literally see the point from. But it wasn't actually attacked until the 9th of June, so 3 days after D-Day. So for 3 days it was basically left alone to bomb and harass the landing of troops, but it's not being reported on history reports, only an after-action report from when the Rangers advanced on the 9th. Might be something you can shine a bit of light on. Michael, thanks for that. I can't help on that one, I'm afraid. But has anyone got any more information on the Maisie defence position near Pointe du Hoc? That's M-A-I-S-Y, Maisie. Thank you very much. Turning to a James Holland interview now, I just want to draw your attention to a great interview by James Holland on the BBC History Extra podcast on the 6th of October. The name of the episode is called Courage Under Fire, and it's an interview with James and about the Sherwood Rangers. So if anyone wants a real insight into the terrifying war fought by the likes of the late Stan Perry in the Sherwood Rangers, you should listen to this. The odds were not good at all for the tankers, and it's seriously great history, so see if you can catch up on that one. Turning to the main event now. Jack Stansfield, prisoner of war. I've mentioned several of Dad's missing comrades in previous episodes, some of whom were captured at Dunkirk, and I've always wondered what happened to them. Now we have a memoir from Jack Stansfield, which describes the fate of at least some of these brave lads captured at Dunkirk. This is a bit of background taken from Dad's book regarding these comrades, and it involves the fighting at Gravelines, not far from Dunkirk in May 1940. Here goes. During the early hours of the next morning, we were defending a bridge at Gravelines when 4 tanks approached us from the direction of Calais, and we fired upon them, causing them to withdraw out of sight. Very soon afterwards, the same tanks came towards us yet again, but this time flying red, white and blue streamers, and they turned out to be British tanks which had been cut off during a tank battle outside of Calais. They immediately joined us in the defence of Gravelines. We lost some good boys here, because apart from the bombing by the Stukas, we were being shelled by the 88mm guns. The enemy infantry tried yet again to attack us, causing casualties to both sides, and not realising how near we were to the enemy, some of our other ranks were taken prisoner, as were Captain Kidd, Captain Foster, and 2nd Lieutenant Farrand, the latter already being wounded. All the inhabitants must have either fled or were hiding in cellars, because we didn't see a single civilian. Considering our strength, we'd put up a good show against a very forceful enemy, who knew that he had the upper hand, and that it was only a matter of time before their victory was assured. For the action we fought at Gravelines, several officers received decorations, and we were mentioned by name in the dispatches of Lord Gort. So I've had no more insight as to the fate of Dad's captured comrades until recently, when I came across an article in the Green Howard magazine, which I subscribed to as a Fellow of the Green Howard Museum. The article's called In Jack's Footsteps, and it was written by Michael and Jamie Stansfield, the son and grandson of Jack Stansfield, and described them tracing Jack's POW record and the history behind it. It includes diary entries that Jack made at the time, and I think it's likely that Captain Kidd Foster and Second Lieutenant Farrand would have followed the same route as Jack did, because Jack Stansfield was a Green Howard, same as Dad, except Jack was in the 5th Battalion and Dad was in the 6th. They had similar experiences during the fighting, albeit they were in different areas. And I'd like to cover a bit of the story which precedes the article to paint the picture of the lead-up. So the following passage comes from Captain W.A.T. Singe, The Story of the Green Howards, 1939-45. This is Chapter 3, The Territorial Battalions in France, or The Retreat to Dunkirk, January to June 1940. The 50th Northumbrian Division, known as 50 Div to all those who served in it, drew its men from Yorkshire, Durham and Northumberland. The units had kept very well up to strength throughout the interwar years, and so were in an advanced state of preparedness when the word came to mobilise. On January the 17th, 1940, the 4th and 5th Battalions were inspected by His Majesty the King, and on the 25th embarked at Southampton en route for France. Landing the next day at Cherbourg, the 50th Division made its way by slow degrees to its assembly area north of Le Mans. The cold was intense. Truck radiators froze while they were running, and when the division started to move up towards the frontier on February the 5th, the roads became almost impassable. So much so that the 5th Battalion, for instance, was ordered to stay at Tourouve until road conditions improved, which was not until a fortnight later. Plans in the event of the German army invading France by way of Holland and Belgium had been worked out in great detail, and the British Expeditionary Force was to advance 60 miles into Belgium to a strong position on the River Dyle in front of Brussels, where it was reported that the Belgians had prepared defences. It's a strange story of order and counter-order, of marches and counter-marches, and of commanding officers at one time separated by 70 miles from their battalions. It's also interesting to see how the 4 battalions of the Green Howards, 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th, although originally paired to different divisions, came together at one moment, then split apart, and finally all assembled, those who were left of them, on the beaches at Dunkirk. But before this point, and on May the 16th, the battalions were almost continually on the move, often without rations, at times separated from their brigades, and indeed with companies and platoons fighting for long periods on their own. It is impossible to tell a coherent story of those chaotic days. The 5th Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel W.E. Bush, Military Cross, and of course Corporal Jack Stansfield, arrived at Tournai. The town was being severely bombed and was partly in flames, and to add further to the difficulties of the drivers still new to driving without lights, a gas alarm was passed down the column. This, however, turned out to be false, and the battalion reached Runay at about 10 o'clock on the night of May the 16th. Here there was some delay, as the advance billeting staff had received 3 successive orders during the night, giving different places each time, and the final destination, Ath, was not reached until the early hours of the 17th. The billets in which they were finally housed are described as being of sorts, which is not surprising perhaps, since the town was full of refugees, surging about in all directions. The battalion, however, proceeded to tackle affairs, and Captain Dennis, who commanded HQ Company, was appointed town major. Amongst the many troubles of this harassed officer was the investigation into the bona fides of still more harassed priests. These had been rounded up indiscriminately by enthusiastic soldiers who'd been warned of German agents in disguise. Oh gosh, that's shades of Stan Perry, if you've listened to his stories. All the preparations to defend the line of the River Dandra were, however, in vain, as early on the 18th, the 50th Division received orders to withdraw behind the River Escaut and to proceed to the Arras area, where a serious threat to the southern flank had developed. And so began the long retreat to Dunkirk. So there you go, that's the backdrop from W.A.T. Singe's book. We'll now move over to Michael Stansfield's article. This is called In Jack's Footsteps, the 5th Battalion Green Howards, 1939-45, by Michael and Jamie Stansfield. One winter's evening, about 2 years before his death, my father Jack Stansfield was sitting at home in front of a coal fire, and without any apparent reason started to talk calmly about his life as a prisoner of war during World War II. I was shocked, as for the first and only time he told me in detail his story. When he died in 1990, amongst his personal papers was an envelope holding some scrappy pieces of card with faded handwritten pencil notes. Jack was held at Stalag20a at Torun, Poland. In late January 1945, the camp was evacuated, as it was in the path of General Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Army in the speedy advance of the Vistula Order offensive. Prisoners were ordered to set out on what became known as the Long March, or the Death March, west, as the German forces attempted to delay the liberation of the POWs by the advancing Soviet army. On closer examination, I realised these notes were a diary Jack kept describing the events which took place from January the 23rd, 1945, as he was evacuated, liberated, and finally returned home. As I read the diary notes he'd written, I was inspired to find out more and to try and find the answers to many of the questions that I now wished I could ask him. I contacted Wartime Guides, a blog and enterprise run by Powell and Hanya, which is dedicated to the preservation of the heritage of the prisoner of war camps in Torun. I provided Powell with the handwritten notes and the information I had about Jack's time in Poland. With my eldest son, Jamie, I travelled to Poland. Following an itinerary put together by Powell, we visited the sites where Jack had been held. Jack was born in 1918 at the Golden Lion Hotel in Malton, which was owned by his grandparents. He attended the local grammar school and played both cricket and football for local teams. On leaving school at 16, he became a clerk for the local auctioneers firm of Bolton and Cooper. With the likelihood of war increasing, Jack and a group of close school friends decided that if they were to join up, they should do it together. They believed that by joining the Territorial Army, they'd serve together, but this was not to happen. On 13th February 1939, the boys completed their attestation and became members of the 5th Battalion the Green Howards, D Company, Malton Detachment. The battalion was embodied on the 1st of September 1939, and after a period at Cottingham, they moved to Chipping Campden in the Cotswolds in late October. On 25th of January 1940, following an inspection by the King, the battalion was shipped from Southampton to France. On the 19th of May 1940, a rearguard contingent consisting of 80 men of D Company were assigned to provide rearguard for the bridges over the River Dandra near Ath in Belgium, the rest of the 5th Battalion having been withdrawn back to Arras. Their orders were to await the arrival of a battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, who were being closely pressed by the enemy. One section of D Company was overrun, and all were killed, except Jack and Lance Corporal Holliday. Jack recounted that they were travelling in a Bren gun carrier, and that the driver told him to crouch behind the armour plating. A short while later, The vehicle was hit by an anti-tank shell. Jack and another soldier were thrown clear, but the driver and the rest of the section were killed. Jack found himself in a ditch, and his first thought was of needing to find his rifle, but this was short-lived as he realised he was staring into the barrel of a Mauser, with a German soldier shouting, "Hand hoch!" So began his life as a prisoner of war. Jack was posted as missing in action. His family back in Malton heard nothing for 6 months. Then, unexpectedly, during a Nazi propaganda broadcast by William Joyce, Lord Haw-Haw, in the autumn of 1940, his name, rank and service number were read out in a list of captured British soldiers. A short while later, it was confirmed by the International Red Cross that he was alive and a prisoner of war at a German POW camp in Poland. Jack spent much of his time in Stalag20A at Torun and Stalag20b at Malbork, although he knew them by their Prussian names of Thorn and Marienburg. Torun stands on the river Vistula in northwestern Poland. Until his rank of corporal had been confirmed by the British authorities, he was made to labour and described having to wade into the icy waters of the Baltic, carrying stones to enlarge the harbour wall at Gdynia, and the underground forts at Torun, which provided the dark, cold and damp accommodation for all those held at Stalag20A. Son Michael picks up the story of their trip. For my son Jamie and I, our trip began at Torun. Stalag20A was made up of 15 fortresses surrounding the city, which had been built in the 19th century to defend the western border of the Kingdom of Prussia. Much of the living accommodation was underground. The most interesting of these was now derelict, dark and very damp. We were able to explore inside using head torches and saw the area in which the camp theatre was situated. And then, most interestingly, the bunker, the punishment cell with its now peeling whitewashed walls covered in graffiti written by the occupants. It made interesting reading. And listener, there's a reference to Churchill in one of these items of graffiti. You can see it in the show notes along with certain other photographs. This particular bit about Churchill said, "Good old Churchill, give the German bees hell." From mid-1942, Jack, along with his friend Tom Marquis, and like many other prisoners, opted to work on a farm. Tom was a professional soldier from the Royal Engineers, who ironically was captured setting charges to demolish the very bridges that D Company were defending. They met shortly after being taken prisoner, and they stayed together throughout the war and remained close friends throughout their lives. The farm life improved their captivity in so much that alongside the Red Cross parcels and those sent from home, which were more readily available in 1943, produce from the farm could be appropriated to supplement their inadequate diet. The group of about a dozen prisoners working on the farm were locked in a barn each night. The local Polish blacksmith, who'd been ordered to install iron bars on the windows, managed to do so in such a way that they could be easily removed, which meant the boys could nip out and forage for food. I still have the wishbone from a chicken that provided an illicit Christmas meal in 1943. Stalag20b Malbork. We were able to visit the site of Stalag20b at Malbork and the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery. Our trip to Malbork took us through the Polish countryside and left Jamie and I wondering if we were passing the site of a farm where Jack had worked. We also visited the site of the Stalag20b subcamp at Gnojewo, where there's a memorial to the prisoners and slave labourers who spent their time in the work camps and farms. Jack spoke of the camaraderie amongst the boys who would all look out for one another. He once told a story of the swift removal of a British prisoner by the German authorities following a request from the prisoners themselves. The man had been caught stealing from his comrades, the consequences of which were only averted by the Germans moving him out of the camp. Sometime in late 44, Jack was back in Toruń. The prisoners were aware of the events on the Western Front and the Allied advance towards Germany. Rumours were rife amongst the British POWs about what their fate would be. They'd all witnessed the treatment of Russian prisoners and Polish nationals by their German captors, and many concluded that the Geneva Convention would be forgotten. Jack's evacuation from Stalag20a began on 20th of January 1945, and this is some of his diary entries. 20th of January. Told at 3 a.m. to be ready to move. Received Red Cross parcel and 6 loaves about 7 a.m. Moved out at 9 a.m. Thorn bombed by Russian Air Force. Ack heavy on all sides. Passed a big column of Russian Jewesses who looked very tired and hungry. Saw a burial on the roadside of a Jewess who died. We discovered that these women had been from a labour camp and had been made to dig defensive positions for the Wehrmacht before the impending Red Army attack. Jack confided that they'd seen the bodies of women hanging from the roadside telegraph poles. He said that they would divert their guards' attention so they could throw food to these starving women. Jack continues, the column made to march quickly and continued to march till dark, having covered 22 kilometres, where we were put into an open field and told to sleep there for the night. Within 10 minutes, the boys were drinking tea in about 6 inches of snow and minus 15 degrees centigrade of frost. 21st of January. Had a sleepless night, and by 6:15 a.m. we were on the march again to Bromberg, 30 kilometres. German control of the column was loosening. At Schubitz, Poles provided hot water for tea. Germans beginning to panic after seeing German civilians witness Russian attack. Continued marching until dusk. We decided to hang to the rear as much as possible and break away. Chaos on the roads brought back memories of Belgium. Arrived in Bromberg about 4 p.m. and found the Gestapo and every German moving out in complete disorder. All bridges hurriedly prepared for demolition. When we were at the side of the town, we tried to contact the partisans, and we were told by the Poles to hide out in the cellar of a house, but decided to move outside the town and hide out. Main column by this time a mile ahead. Met up with Captain Allen, Royal Army Medical Corps, and a party of senators, and we put up at a house about 2 kilometres from the town despite guards' order, who were in a panic. More boys joined us. About 10 p.m. got down to sleep, but there were quite a lot of bridges being blown. 22nd of January. Civilians still passing, but we kept very quiet. Stalag officer called our immediate resumption of the march. The day was very uneventful. Russians reported 25 kilometres west of Bromberg. Told to have the lights out by 8 p.m, but by 7 p.m. most of the boys trying to sleep. About 11 p.m. we heard tanks passing by, but thought they were German. Heavy firing and machine gun fire. Our numbers increased to 120. 23rd of January. About 2 a.m. Russian troops came into the house, and after a few minutes we convinced the Russians that we were English. Ammunition dumps being blown and very heavy firing all around us, but the Russians said everything was okay. An officer came and told us to stay until daylight, when we moved to a village 5 kilometres outside Nakel, where we were told by the Poles to stay as there was heavy fighting going on in Nakel. Tom and RSM went with Paul to Nakel and came back with a note signed by a Russian officer saying we must go to Nakel. So we went and stayed with Poles, made very welcome by all. Jack went on to describe the assistance of a Polish partisan boy of about 14 who was also in the house. He spoke some Russian, and with shouts of "Churchill, Churchill," they managed to convince these soldiers to get an officer who arrived a few minutes later. He agreed there were escaped British prisoners of war, so must not be shot. The group was now about 120 men. They marched into the town of Nakel, behind the Union flag that had been brought from the camp, where it had been used to cover the coffin of any of their comrades who died whilst in captivity. He spoke of getting a great reception from the senior Russian officer, who insisted that they be given the best billets for the night. 24th of January. On the way again to Shubin, where we joined a number of American officers, received Red Cross parcel, had a shower, bath, and a good night's sleep. This note was one of the most intriguing in the diary notes until we realised that Shubin was the place where another liberated POW camp off Lag 64 was situated. During our visit we went to the local museum and had a meeting with a local historian who gave us an account of Shubin at that time and explained why Jack would have gone there. Originally used as a camp for Polish prisoners, it was known as Stalag20b. It was then renamed Oflag 21b and was used for British, French and Commonwealth POWs. Finally, in 1943 it was renamed as Oflag 64 and was used for American prisoners, with its former occupants being moved out to Stalag Luft 3, infamous as the scene for the Great Escape. This camp was evacuated on 21st of January 45 and liberated 2 days later by the Russian army. Around 200 men were left, including those who were ill and some who'd hidden in an uncompleted escape tunnel. Oflag 64 was used by the Russians as a collection centre for POWs who were picked up by the advancing Red Army, and it was there that Jack and his comrades were taken by truck. One of the most important things we learned during our visit was the suffering imposed on the Polish people throughout this period. This was never truer than during our visit to Shubin. We came to understand that the Geneva Convention provided a level of protection to the British POWs that the Polish people did not have. On the site of the Shubin camp there now stands a reform school for boys. The only remaining hut stands derelict, although there remains evidence of the site's former use, including barbed wire, floodlight covers, and the house of the camp commandant. During our visit, the boys in the reform school proudly showed us a scale model they'd made of the camp. Back to Jack's diary. 25th of January. Clean up and had plenty to eat. Expecting to move any time from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. Was on guard at the camp gate. 26th of January. Still in camp and resting. Some more boys joined us. 27th of January. Still in camp but doing nothing special. Had a few drinks of vodka in the afternoon and it put me to sleep, unfortunately. It was also at Shubin that we experienced one of the most moving moments of our visit. I stood at the site of the main gate, knowing that my father had stood on that very spot some 70 years earlier. There's a picture in the show notes. We returned to the local town, and in tribute to my father and Jamie's grandpa, we too had a few drinks of vodka. Ah, dear. 28th of January. Left Shubin by truck and stayed the night with Pauls at Holland Salsa. In a later script, Jack wrote that both he and Tom, as well as a few of the boys, were left behind waiting for transport, and they were approached by a war correspondent who filmed and photographed them. Jack writes that this man spoke particularly good English and introduced himself as Major General Winterton. They felt at the time that he'd given himself this rank as a ploy to impress the Russians. We've tried to discover who this person could be. From 1942 to 1945, the Moscow correspondent for both the newspaper The Daily News and the BBC Overseas Service was Paul Winterton. We've been unable to substantiate this was the same man. but we think it highly unlikely, as Stalin did not like the presence of Allied journalists near his army. 29th of January. Rose at 4:30 a.m, 6:30 Russian time. Had a wash, shave, and good breakfast, provided by ... the Poles. Told we should move off at 8:30, but then the time altered to 12 Russian. After this entry, the pencilled notes have become very faded and exceedingly difficult to read. They left Aino-Roclaw and travelled by truck to a small town, possibly Kutno, arriving at 2:30 a.m. Jack says he slept until 10:30 a.m, then had a good wash and breakfast. In many accounts written by POWs, there seems to be an obsession with cleanliness, but this is not surprising given the ease that disease could spread and the continuous problem with lice. From this point, Jack didn't record the rest of his journey until he returned home. We believe that this was because he felt safe and was beginning to believe that they would survive. Many men kept diaries to pass on to their families, and alongside these notes was a list of names and addresses of Jack's comrades. The promise boys made to each other was to contact the families of any comrade who did not make it home. The party was taken to Warsaw by truck. Jack on many occasions described the devastation they saw in this city, and it clearly upset him. It seems there was a steady stream of empty trucks returning along the Russian supply routes, and this is how the liberated prisoners managed to travel. They remained in Warsaw for 3 weeks before being taken by train to Odessa, a journey of 1,000 kilometres, which took over a week. Once in Odessa, they were put on a British ship, the SS Moreton Bay. This was the first Allied ship to sail through the Dardanelles and into the Black Sea during the war. There were 1,700 ex-POWs on board, including 1,200 Americans and 241 British. Once at sea, they were given a diet which allowed them to slowly readjust to the larger portions of food. The ship moored in Istanbul to take on board fuel and supplies, then sailed on to Port Said in Egypt. Once in Egypt, they were given a period for sightseeing before boarding the SS Samaria, and this we believe was about the 10th of March 1945. This vessel was a former liner which had been converted into a troop ship and had made many Atlantic crossings during the war years. All the men were reclothed and rekitted on board the ship. The Samaria anchored off Naples to take on more troops, but no shore leave was given. It then left in a convoy bound for Gibraltar. Jack said that as they approached the Straits of Gibraltar, they were rostered to look out for mines and were given rifles to shoot at any they encountered. As they sailed up the coast of Spain, he recalled that many depth charges were dropped by their escort ships, as there was still a threat from U-boats. On Good Friday, 30th of March, 1945, the Samaria docked in Liverpool. 400 men were taken by train overnight to Amersham in Buckinghamshire, where between 7 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. all were rekitted, given a medical and x-ray, signed papers, and were allowed to send telegrams home. Jack arrived in York at 9:30 p.m. on Easter Saturday and took the early morning milk train to Malton, arriving back in his hometown at 5:30 a.m. on Easter Sunday, 1945. He was met at the station by a local policeman who walked with him up to the Golden Lion Hotel, where his father was the licensee. One can only imagine the welcome he received. His father opened a bottle of whiskey, and by mid-morning it had been consumed by Jack's dad and the policeman. Jack lived in Malton for the rest of his life. He went back to work at Bolton and Cooper. He married in 1952 and had a family. He was a well-known and respected local figure, and over 300 people attended his funeral. Jack wore a collar and tie every day. Yes, he only owned 2 ties. One was black, and the other was his green Howard tie. Once a green Howard, always a green Howard. Wow. And that's pretty much it. What a brilliant story. And once again we've heard how the Polish people came up trumps in doing their best to look after their reluctant visitors. I'll say thank you very much to Michael Stansfield and son Jamie for doing such a brilliant job in stitching together the history and combining it with both Jack's diary and their own visit. It must have been quite a tricky job, so many thanks guys for doing all that. I can imagine it took absolutely ages. A posthumous thanks, if that's the right phrase, to your father and grandfather, Corporal Jack Stansfield, for his service and efforts to record his POW experience. I wonder if Jack met or knew Dad's captured comrades, because I can't help wondering if their paths crossed at some point in Poland. And at least Jack's story gives me a huge insight into what may have become of them. And for all that, I hereby present the Stansville Family this month's How Good Is That award. And thanks also to the Green Howards magazine. I'll remind you that there are various photographs in the show notes, together with an advert for a super book about the Green Howards. It's called A History in Photographs by Roger Chapman. So if you want to get your hands on a quality piece of photographic history about the Green Howards, then this is your book. Thank you so very much for your support and for making the time to listen to me, and please do hear me next time. I'm now going out on a medley of Stan Perry's favourite moments, and after that there's a PS about another British POW experience. So keep listening, and for now I'm Paul Cheall saying bye bye now.
I said handy hock or something like that.
Yes.
And the first one with his hands up I shot. Kicked the door open, saw a movement, shot, and it went bing, 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 bing. And they were a couple of Germans who dressed up as priests. We had this pistol shoot. I came first.
Surprise.
Another Sherman Ranger who was waiting to go back, he came second. Leadership is about self-discipline for a start, and about setting an example.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of respect, but it's a two-way thing, respect. And they said if it hadn't been decelerated by that photograph album,
crikey.
I should have been a goner. The gunner had painted A-K-I-L-L-A. Killer. He didn't know the difference. Morning, mayhaps, Jay. Are ye all tag band slay? He fears nothing, but never takes stupid risks.
Right.
And I was very proud of that. Keep taking the pills, keep taking it easy, and keep taking a wee dram every night.
P.S. This short story has been taken from the BBC People's War website, Escape to Captivity. This is by Peter Orchard. He was a POW in Germany in the army. He was a warrant officer in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, later captain. And here goes. After active service in Palestine, emergency 1936-39, I was in Malta until 1942, when I was posted to the 8th Army in the Western Desert, and after skirmishes with Rommel, we moved to Tobruk. The army was besieged in Tobruk, and we surrendered into the hands of the Germans. They ordered us to proceed to the POW compound some 5 miles away. The Germans said we could walk there or go in our own trucks, which we'd not had time to destroy. We said, OK. Having made holes in the sumps of the trucks, they just got us there before the engines seized up solid. The next POW camp at Benghazi was under control of the Italians. Water was a problem. They produced it in 44-gallon drums that had been used for diesel fuel and had not been properly cleaned out. Result, massive diarrhoea in some 2,000 prisoners. We were soon taken by boat to Italy, first in Brindisi, southern Italy, then to a camp north of Rome near Ancona. Italy capitulated, Mussolini was killed, and the guards smashed their rifles against the nearest post, tore off their uniforms and shouted, "The war is finished. I'm going home to multi-vino, multi-pasta and multi-nicky-nick." A company of Germans soon arrived, and we were on a train through the Brenner Pass to Germany, to Stalag 5, POW camp. That was a former concentration camp for the Jews. We had to strip and tie our cloths in a bundle or bag if we had one. These were put in the cyanide gas chamber, and we went naked into the showers. Our clothes came out stinking of the cyanide gas. We had to shake them for some minutes before dressing. My weight had dropped to 7 stone. At last the Red Cross parcels arrived to supplement our POW food of a couple of slices of black rye bread, potatoes and turnips, with occasional goat meat in the daily stew. The potatoes were boiled in their skins, and we took it in turns to have the skins to make a biscuit, baked on top of the fire stove that each hut had for heating. A corporal of the Australian Army, Tom Ward, was captured with the resistance in North Italy and was being taken to Berlin for trial as a spy, which meant the death penalty. He was kept in the cooler outside of the main camp and was to be bathed and deloused in the camp's big shower block, where we had a monthly shower, before going to Berlin. The key to the gate from the camp to the showers was trusted to a sergeant of the South African Army who spoke German. He locked up at night, handed the key to the guardhouse, and drew it the next day for prisoners assembled from each hut in turn to shower. The camp held more than 10,000 prisoners of all nationalities, so the shower house was very large and in constant daily use. On the day Tom was to be showered and deloused, the key was not issued by the Germans, but the escape committee knew this in advance, so the night before it was arranged that the padlock would only look secured before the key was handed in. All was set for the escape into the POW camp proper. The POW camp was for senior non-commissioned officers, sergeants and warrant officers, so there were some good brains at work on the escape committee. In the morning set for Tom Ward's delousing and shower, he stripped naked and put his clothes in the gas chamber. Now he was the only person in the very large shower room, with the guards on the far side of the shower room. Outside the gate from the main camp was a rigged party of prisoners, supposedly ready to take a shower. The padlock was unhitched, and into the shower room rushed naked prisoners from the main camp. The guards were taken by surprise and shouted, "Rouse, rouse, get out." They did, but with Tom Ward, who was quickly dressed with battle dress supplied by the escape committee. Now they were all, including Tom, back in the main camp. The Germans were livid when they realised what had happened, and all hell was let loose. It did not take long for a company of SS to arrive, ordering the whole camp out for an inspection count and identification of all prisoners. Tom Ward was in our hut. The question was where to hide him. Above the ceiling, the slanting roof had sacks of straw in the gap between the outside walls and the ceiling and sloping roof. Tom got inside one of these. The whole camp was kept outside for some 16 hours, and we were checked against the records kept by the Germans. The search included guards from the SS going up above the ceilings and bayoneting the sacks. By the time they got to our hut, which was about the last, they were obviously getting tired, and the bayoneting missed Tom Ward. This was not to be the end of the searching. We learned that notices were put up in the surrounding village, offering a reward for his capture. They just did not know where he was, but were determined to get him. 2 weeks later, a battalion of SS arrived in armoured cars. We were ordered out for further checks, and the SS took the place apart. This time we knew they were deadly serious. So Tom Ward got down inside the night latrine, a sewage pit, and stood in the sewage for hours. Just ghastly. I just don't know how he stuck it. He got through it with terrible uric acid burns which took weeks to heal. He finally took over identification of a South African sergeant who'd hung himself. The prisoner records were kept in the German main office by POWs working as clerks, and they arranged the switch, even Tom Ward's fingerprints. Tom Ward passed subsequent German identity checks, and they never twigged it. He remained in the camp until we were freed by the Russian advance. In January 1944, I had the misfortune of contracting cerebral spinal meningitis. They had to put me in a straitjacket because the pressure on the nervous system caused me to thrash about uncontrollably. In the hospital I was treated by a French POW doctor. That night a Red Cross supply of drugs came in from Switzerland. The doctor said he very nearly didn't give me the sulfonamide drug that eventually cured me, because he thought I was too far gone to save. I recovered enough for a German medical board, who recommended me for a POW exchange, Category B, an exchange that never actually took place. In any case, I did make a slow recovery during the next 15 months, up to the time that the Russian advance caused the Germans to abandon our POW camp. While recuperating in the hospital, an American soldier with a serious gunshot wound on the side of his head came into the camp hospital. He was from Texas, and the doctor could not understand what he said. So I found myself interpreting broad Texan accent into English. That night, before another consignment of Red Cross drugs came in, the doctor told me that he didn't think the American sergeant would live the night out. But early next morning, the excited doctor took me to see the American sitting up smiling. "It's almost a miracle," said the doctor. "I just gave him 3 shots of penicillin, a new drug just out, and look at him now." He fully recovered and came back into the main camp with me. I learned some years later that the discovery was worked on by Mrs. Suzanne Triton, my own very good friend and wine-making mentor, who was an assistant to Dr. Fleming, who made penicillin. Stalag 4 was an ex-concentration camp. On the exercise field to the north, there was a series of humps. Our senior representative asked the Germans if we could flatten it to make a playing field for games. This was firmly refused by the commandant. It was later learned that the field was a burial ground. The humps were the top of a series of lime pit trenches, where it was said were the bodies of Jews who died in a cholera epidemic when the camp was a Jewish concentration camp. 2 years after the British arrived in the camp, a reading of the camp's electric meter showed a 1,000% increase in electric consumption. A big raid took place to find out why. This led to tables between the British sector huts full of confiscated equipment of all kinds, from electric fires in the RAF huts to numerous brew kettles to make tea and coffee from Red Cross parcels. These were mainly 2 metal plates separated by a piece of wood, placed in a brew can, and the wires were then connected to nails and another piece of wood for a plug. When plugged in, the whole thing was alive and very lethal if touched. We'd stripped the wiring from the outside lavatories that were disconnected anyway. We wired the mains up to secret sockets behind 2 tiny holes in the wooden walls of the hut. One thing the Germans never did find was the radio set in our hut. It was under the seat of a stool our hut commander would sit on as he was allowed to stay in the hut when a search took place. We had a large homemade map of the war zone and pinned up little flags to show the Allies and Russian advance from the news we got. The German sergeant major would come to find out the war situation. He'd say, No, that's not correct," knowing full well it would come on the German news sometimes a week later. He was comparatively friendly, and we would have a laugh at his expense. In the end, he'd come in almost every day. The camp newsletter was also compiled from news we got from our radio, which was made from bits and pieces bought from the guards, with cigarettes and sometimes coffee from the Red Cross parcels. The bulk of these parcels came from Canada, mainly because the Canadian Red Cross would escort the parcels and cigarettes to Germany. From UK, some 60% of the parcels, especially cigarettes, were pillaged first in the UK ports, then across Spain, Switzerland, and of course Germany. I only got some 15% of the cigarettes Dad and Mum sent me. The distribution depended on how many parcels were available, and at the very best it was 1 food parcel between 2 of us. They were only available about half the time. The end of the war in Europe for us in the POW camp came with the advance of the Russians in 1945. The Germans were fleeing to the other side of the River Elbe and wanted us to join them. Our man of confidence refused the German offer to take us, some 10,000 of us, across to the other side of the River Elbe. The Russian liberation consisted of an officer on horseback riding into the Russian compound. "You are liberated in the great name of the USSR." He then said, "Those who are fit can draw a rifle from the horse-drawn trucks and join the front." Then a prisoner shouted about someone, "That man is a German dressed as a prisoner." So the officer drew his pistol and shot him dead on the spot. He continued, "The rest are at liberty to go, walk, home." He did later find some dead on the roadside in their attempt to go home to Russia. The Russian sector was quite separate from the European sector of the POW camp, because they were not protected by the Geneva Convention. In fact, the Germans starved very many of them to death. They had to pull carts with tanks on them, used to empty the sewage from the night latrines at the end of each hut. They also had to pump this sewage out on their rounds of the camp using hand pumps. The sewage was taken to the fields to fertilise the turnips, etc., used to feed the POWs. Russian officers said that soldiers were expendable. The camp was liberated on the 14th of April 1945. My friend was Eric Skinner, DFC, an air gunner of the RAF, and we both went for a walk about to the nearby villages where we liberated 2 bikes. The houses were mostly empty, just a few very old people who'd been left behind the fleeing population. We entered a villa that had been pillaged by Russian soldiers. They'd just used their rifle, but smashing lovely furniture in wanton destruction. But we were free.